Welcome to the extremely boring stories. Today we listening Alexander the Great, the long, quiet machinery behind a short, loud life. You usually meet Alexander the Great at the moment he is already moving, charging, conquering, crossing rivers with banners snapping in the wind. History likes him in motion. But before the noise, before the armor and shouting, there was a long stretch of waiting. Years filled with routine, repetition, and preparation. This part is quieter. This is the boy who learned how to sit still before he learned how to rule. You are in Pella, the capital of Macedon, in the mid-4th century BCE. It is not a grand city by later standards. The streets are practical, often muddy. The palace smells of oil lamps, horses, and smoke. Macedonia is not yet impressive to the great cities of Greece. Athens sees it as rough. Sparta barely acknowledges it. Persia does not consider it worth worrying about, yet. Alexander is born here in 356 BCE, not into mystery, but into administration. His father, Philip II, is constantly away. He is reforming the army, reorganizing land, negotiating marriages, crushing rebellions, and managing nobles who are only loyal when watched carefully. Philip's greatness is built on planning, drilling, and patience. These traits surround Alexander long before the boy understands them. As a child, Alexander's days are structured. He wakes early. There are lessons before physical training, and physical training before meals. Meals are not lavish for a child. Macedonia prides itself on toughness. Overeating is discouraged. Wine is diluted. Discipline begins in small ways. His mother, Olympias, is intense, watchful, deeply religious. She tells stories about heroes, about destiny, about bloodlines tracing back to Achilles. These stories are not shouted. They are repeated, over and over. They sink in slowly. Olympias does not teach Alexander to conquer. She teaches him that he is supposed to. That expectation is heavier than armor. But much of Alexander's childhood is unremarkable in appearance. Tutors drill him in reading and recitation. He memorizes Homer not for pleasure but because it is expected. The Iliad becomes a mental exercise, a training manual in virtue and failure. You can imagine him repeating lines aloud, not understanding them fully yet, just learning how to hold them in his head. Waiting is a skill here. Alexander waits for his father to return from campaigns. He waits for meals. He waits while adults argue about alliances. He waits through ceremonies that mean little to him at the time. This waiting teaches him something subtle. Power moves slowly before it moves fast. When Aristotle arrives to teach him, the days become heavier with information. Philosophy, ethics, biology, geography. Not thrilling subjects for a boy who will later ride at the front of armies, but they matter. Aristotle emphasizes categorization, observation, causes and effects. Alexander learns how to listen without speaking, how to absorb without reacting. You might expect sparks, genius moments, dramatic confrontations. Instead, there is repetition, long walks while listening, lists of animals, maps drawn and redrawn, discussions that end without conclusions. This is the boring part of greatness, and it lasts for years. Physical training fills the afternoons. Wrestling, running, weapon drills. Not heroic combat. Controlled movement. Balance. Endurance. Mistakes corrected quietly. Injuries treated without fuss. Alexander learns that pain is not special. It is managed, then ignored. One famous story appears here: Bucephalus, the horse no one else can ride. But even this moment, often told as dramatic, is actually about observation. Alexander notices the horse fears its own shadow. He turns it toward the sun. It works. Philip is impressed. But what matters is not courage, it is attention. Alexander learns that careful watching can replace force. And still, most days end without anything happening. Philip returns occasionally, full of plans and reports. Alexander listens. He hears about logistics more than glory. How many men can be fed? How long a campaign can last before morale cracks? Where supply lines fail? These conversations are not meant for a child, but the child hears them anyway. At court, Alexander watches nobles compete for favor. He sees how silence can be safer than speech. He notices who stands where, who speaks last, who avoids eye contact. These details do not excite him, but they lodge in memory. There are tensions. Olympias and Philip argue. New wives arrive. Half-brothers are born. Succession becomes complicated. Alexander learns early that inheritance is not guaranteed, it is defended. But even this lesson comes slowly, through atmosphere rather than action. By his teenage years, Alexander is restless, but trained. He has learned how to endure boredom without breaking focus. He has learned to wait while staying alert. This is not something historians emphasize, but it is essential. Campaigns are mostly waiting for orders, weather, supplies, answers. When Philip finally gives Alexander responsibility, commanding a cavalry wing at Chaeronea, it looks sudden. It is not. It is the release of pressure built up over years of preparation that looked, from the outside, like nothing much happening at all. By the time Alexander reaches his mid-teens, the waiting changes shape. It does not disappear, but it tightens. You can feel it in the way days are planned more strictly, in how eyes follow him at court. He is no longer just a prince being prepared. He is a problem that must be managed carefully. Philip II is still very much alive, very much ruling, and very much suspicious of anyone who might weaken his control, including his own son. You live now in a court where loyalty is temporary. Macedonian nobles do not trust blood alone, they trust advantage. Philip understands this deeply. His rule depends on keeping powerful families balanced against each other, rewarded just enough, watched constantly. Alexander grows up observing this quiet chess game. No one explains it to him directly. He learns it the way people learn weather, by paying attention to patterns. Philip begins to take Alexander with him on campaigns, not to fight, but to observe. You can imagine long rides where little is said. The king studies terrain. Officers discuss supply routes. Orders are given, revised, delayed. Alexander listens. He learns that command is rarely about shouting. It is about timing. At 16, Philip leaves Alexander in charge of Macedonia while he campaigns north. This is not a ceremonial role. The kingdom is unstable. Tribes rebel. Nobles test boundaries. Almost immediately, a revolt breaks out among the Madi, a Thracian tribe. Alexander does not hesitate. He suppresses the revolt and founds a city, Alexandropolis, on the site. The act is practical, not glorious. A city means control, taxes, roads, surveillance. It is an administrative solution disguised as conquest. Philip approves. But approval from Philip is never simple. Praise is sparse. Correction is constant. Philip wants Alexander competent, not confident. Confidence creates rivals. At court, the tension thickens. Philip marries again. This time a Macedonian noblewoman, Cleopatra Eurydice. This is politically significant. It threatens Alexander's claim. At a wedding feast, words are exchanged. Insults spill out, fueled by wine. Philip draws a sword and stumbles drunk. Alexander leaves the hall, humiliated and furious. This moment matters not because of drama, but because of restraint. Alexander does not rebel. He does not gather supporters. He spends time away from court, watching, calculating. He learns something difficult: power does not reward emotional honesty. It rewards endurance. The insult is remembered, not acted upon. Meanwhile, his education continues, but it narrows. Philosophy gives way to tactics. Ethics gives way to necessity. Aristotle's influence lingers, but reality intrudes. Alexander begins to see the limits of ideals. He understands that kingship requires choices that philosophers avoid. You can sense the shift. The boy who memorized Homer now uses it selectively, as a moral reference rather than a rule book. Achilles is admired, but also studied as a warning. Glory is expensive. Alexander trains with the companions, the elite cavalry. These men are older, experienced, skeptical. They do not see him as a legend. They see him as Philip's son. Respect is not automatic. It is earned through consistency. He eats with them, marches with them, listens more than he speaks. He watches how disagreements are handled quietly, how decisions are justified afterward, how mistakes are absorbed by the group rather than highlighted. What you notice here is how Alexander learns obedience before command. He follows orders precisely. He does not embellish. He understands that discipline is a language soldiers trust. Philip tests him constantly. Small commands, limited authority, situations designed to fail if mishandled. Alexander responds by being methodical, not brilliant, reliable. And then comes Chaeronea, 338 BCE. This battle is often remembered as decisive, dramatic, world-changing. But if you stand within it, it is confusing and slow. Dust, noise, poor visibility, orders passed imperfectly. Philip commands the right wing. Alexander commands the left cavalry, supported by seasoned officers. Philip feigns retreat. The Athenians pursue. Gaps open. This is not improvisation, it is rehearsed. Alexander charges into the opening. The famous sacred band of Thebes is destroyed. Later historians celebrate the charge. What they overlook is the waiting beforehand. Alexander does not move early. He does not chase glory. He waits for the exact moment. This is Philip's lesson, learned well. After the battle, Alexander does not claim credit publicly. Philip does. Alexander watches how victory is distributed, how narratives are shaped. He sees that memory is managed. From this point on, Alexander is no longer just being trained. He is being tolerated as an eventual replacement. This is dangerous. Kings are rarely comfortable grooming successors. The court becomes colder. Conversations become cautious. Alexander learns to measure words. He keeps his ambitions quiet. But inside, something shifts. The waiting now feels finite. When Philip is assassinated in 336 BCE, it happens suddenly, but not unpredictably. Macedonian courts breed violence. Alexander moves fast. He secures loyalty, executes rivals, reasserts control. The boy who waited now acts decisively. But what matters is not the speed, it is the preparation. Years of watching, listening, enduring boredom, swallowing insult. These are the tools he uses in the first days of his reign. When people talk about Alexander the Great, they talk about movement. Marches, charges, crossings, sieges. Maps with arrows sweeping east. But none of that movement happens unless something far less exciting holds it together. Before armies move, someone counts. Someone writes. Someone waits for seals, lists, and confirmations. You are now standing still, not on a battlefield, but inside the machinery that keeps Macedonia functioning. Macedonia, when Alexander takes the throne in 336 BCE, is not an empire. It is a kingdom held together by agreements, obligations, and habits. These are not written constitutions. They are expectations remembered by people who expect to be rewarded for remembering them correctly. There is no single capital office buzzing with clerks in neat rows. Administration happens wherever the king happens to be. Power is portable. Records travel with the court, packed into chests, carried by men whose names are never recorded. You should imagine wax tablets, leather scrolls, wooden tally sticks. Nothing permanent. Everything vulnerable to fire, rain, theft, and forgetting. At the center of this system is the king. But the king does not govern alone. Macedonia is divided into regions controlled by local elites, men with land, armed followers, and family histories that stretch back generations. These men are loyal not to ideas, but to continuity. They want predictability. Taxes that are not surprising. Commands that are clear. Philip II understood this well. Alexander inherits it. Before Alexander ever marches east, he spends time doing something far less romantic, confirming loyalty. Messengers are sent. Oaths are renewed. Hostages are exchanged. Promises are repeated aloud so they cannot later be denied. This is slow work. Days pass without visible progress. But each delay prevents a rebellion later. Taxes are not collected efficiently by modern standards. Some regions pay in silver, others in grain, others provide men instead of money. Accounting is approximate. Precision is less important than balance. If one noble feels cheated, another must be rewarded to compensate. You learn quickly that Macedonian administration runs on memory more than paper. Who owes what is often known by reputation. Disputes are settled in person, with witnesses. Written records support memory, they do not replace it. Alexander, newly king, sits through these proceedings. He listens. He confirms old agreements rather than inventing new ones. This is intentional. Change creates friction. He postpones friction. There is also the matter of the army payroll. Soldiers expect regular payment. Not generous, predictable. Missed payments lead to resentment. Resentment leads to mutiny. The army's loyalty is maintained not by speeches, but by consistency. Before a single campaign against Persia begins, Alexander ensures the treasury can support months of absence. Loans are secured. Temple funds are borrowed. Debts are deferred. None of this is heroic. It is necessary. You might expect Alexander to resent this paperwork. Instead, he engages with it closely. He asks questions. He remembers figures. He notices which officials speak confidently and which avoid detail. He begins to understand that conquest without administration collapses quickly. There is also diplomacy, another slow art. Greek city-states must be managed carefully. They are not conquered outright. They are led. The League of Corinth exists on paper and in ceremony, not in emotion. Most Greeks resent Macedonian dominance but accept it because resistance is costly. Alexander inherits his father's position as hegemon. He does not celebrate it. He reinforces it. Garrisons remain. Hostages remain. Assemblies meet, but outcomes are guided. This is the dull reality behind unity. What you notice, if you pay attention, is how much of Alexander's early reign involves not marching east. He secures Greece first. Rebellions are crushed quickly and decisively, not out of cruelty, but to reduce future paperwork. The destruction of Thebes is often remembered emotionally. Administratively, it sends a clear message: resistance creates unbearable complexity. Order simplifies governance. Behind the scenes, officials begin preparing for a campaign that will last years. Grain storage is assessed. Roads are surveyed. Supply depots are planned. This work does not move quickly because mistakes are expensive. Alexander approves plans personally. Not because he mistrusts his officers, but because he wants to understand the limits. He learns how far an army can march before it must stop. How many days grain lasts. How weather disrupts schedules. This knowledge shapes every decision he will later make in Asia. There are no grand declarations at this stage. Just lists. Names. Quantities. Distances. You can imagine long evenings spent reviewing reports by lamplight, not because Alexander enjoys it, but because power demands attention even when nothing exciting is happening. This is where his earlier training shows. He can tolerate boredom. He can focus on repetition. He does not rush the process. Because rushing creates gaps. And gaps, in administration, are where empires fail. As preparations near completion, one thought hangs quietly over everything: Macedonia is stable now. But only because Alexander is present. Once he leaves, the system must hold without him. Once the army begins to assemble, administration does not become simpler. It becomes fragile. You might expect that when Alexander prepares to leave Macedonia, systems click neatly into place, like doors locking before a long journey. What actually happens is more uncertain. Every official knows that once the king crosses into Asia, answers will take weeks to return, if they return at all. Decisions will have to be made without confirmation. Mistakes will be permanent. This is the problem of distance, and it shapes everything. Alexander does not leave Macedonia empty-handed. He leaves behind regents, trusted men with limited authority. Not too much power, never that, but enough to keep things running. Antipater becomes the most important of these. His role is not glorious. He is tasked with preventing collapse through routine. Antipater's work is invisible unless it fails. You should imagine him dealing with petitions, disputes, tax shortfalls, and nervous allies. Greek cities complain. Nobles argue. Messengers arrive with half-stories from Asia, weeks out of date. Antipater cannot improvise wildly. He must interpret Alexander's intentions based on patterns established before departure. This is where earlier paperwork matters. Past agreements become guides. Precedent becomes law. Meanwhile, Alexander moves east, and the administrative load moves with him. Wherever the king camps becomes a temporary capital. Dents serve as offices. Officers double as clerks. Orders are written, copied, and dispatched daily. Communication is slow. Couriers travel by horse and ship, vulnerable to weather and interception. A message from Asia Minor to Macedonia can take weeks. By the time instructions arrive, circumstances have changed. So Alexander learns to issue broad directives rather than precise commands. Flexibility becomes policy. You notice this most clearly in how conquered territories are handled. Alexander does not replace entire systems at once. That would require oversight he cannot provide. Instead, he keeps local administrators where possible, supervises them lightly, and demands only what can be enforced: taxes, troops, loyalty. Satraps, regional governors, are left in place or appointed carefully. Power is divided. Military authority and financial authority are often separated to prevent rebellion. This creates inefficiency, but reduces risk. Inefficiency is tolerated. Revolt is not. Records in these regions vary wildly. Some areas keep detailed accounts. Others rely on oral tradition. Alexander's officials adapt. Uniformity is postponed. Control comes first. You begin to see a pattern. Alexander governs not by imposing perfection, but by managing imperfection. Back in Macedonia and Greece, Antipater faces growing strain. With the king absent, old resentments resurface. Athens debates rebellion. Sparta watches quietly. Macedonian nobles grow restless. You can imagine disputes over taxes owed in unfamiliar units, arguments about harvest expectations, confusion over obligations. These are settled case by case. There is no grand reform yet. That would require time Alexander does not have. What keeps the system functional is constant movement, not of armies, but of information. Letters, reports, requests, corrections. Everything flows toward the king, is filtered, then flows outward again. Alexander reads more than people realize. He dictates responses late at night. He listens to summaries while eating. He asks follow-up questions days later, testing whether details were remembered correctly. This habit frustrates his officers, but it also trains them. Accuracy becomes a survival skill. One of the dullest but most important administrative acts is appointment review. Officials who fail quietly are replaced quietly. There are no speeches, just reassignment, dismissal, or removal. Punishment is often procedural rather than dramatic. You start to understand that Alexander's empire grows not only by winning battles, but by sustaining routines across distance. Most of these routines are imperfect. Some are corrupt, but they persist. Back home, Antipater faces the constant fear that Alexander will never return. What then? There is no written succession plan. Authority rests on expectation rather than law. So Antipater reinforces tradition. Festivals continue. Courts operate. Taxes are collected as usual. Life must feel normal, even as the king conquers lands people have never seen. This normality is strategic. As Alexander pushes deeper into Asia, administrative strain increases. Regions multiply. Languages change. Time stretches. Each new conquest adds paperwork before it adds profit. And yet, the system holds, for now. But one unresolved tension grows quietly beneath the routine. Alexander's conquests are accelerating faster than his ability to integrate them administratively. If you strip Alexander's campaigns of their drama, remove the speeches, the charges, the names of battles, you are left with a simpler question that repeats every day. What will everyone eat tomorrow? This question is not poetic. It is practical. It decides where armies go, when they stop, and whether they survive. Most of Alexander's time on campaign is shaped not by enemies, but by food. You are now with the army as it begins to move in earnest, crossing into Asia Minor. The men do not march on inspiration. They march on grain. An average Macedonian soldier eats roughly a kilogram of food per day. Mostly grain, wheat or barley, sometimes supplemented with dried meat, cheese, or olives. Wine is common but diluted. Water is essential and unreliable. Multiply that by tens of thousands of men, plus animals, camp followers, and officers, and the numbers become heavy. Every day, the army consumes tons of food. There is no refrigeration. No packaged rations. Everything spoils, runs out, or must be replaced. This means marching routes are chosen carefully. Roads are not about speed, they are about access. Fields, rivers, towns, and storage facilities matter more than open ground. Before the army ever arrives, foragers are sent out. These men search for grain stores, herds, wells. They negotiate when possible. They seize when necessary. Their work is repetitive and dangerous. They are rarely celebrated. You notice how often the army stops, not because of battle, but because food needs time to arrive. Supplies move slower than men. Carts break. Animals die. Weather ruins plans. Alexander understands this deeply. His father taught him that an army which outruns its supplies defeats itself. So Alexander moves deliberately, even when he could push forward. This frustrates younger officers eager for glory. It does not frustrate quartermasters, who know better. Most soldiers spend their days doing very little. They march, then wait. They grind grain by hand. They repair sandals. They stand guard. They sleep. They complain. Hunger sharpens complaint. A well-fed army tolerates discomfort. A hungry one resents everything. Alexander pays attention to this. He eats what his men eat. Not out of symbolism alone, but practicality. If the food is bad, he needs to know. If rations are short, he needs to feel it. You can imagine evenings where nothing happens except distribution. Grain measured out. Wine diluted. Arguments over portions. Officers intervene. Order restored. These moments matter more than speeches. Water is an even greater concern. Rivers determine routes. Wells determine camps. In dry regions, scouts are sent ahead not to find enemies, but to find drinkable water. Men fall ill from bad water. Dysentery spreads quietly. There are no cures. Doctors treat symptoms and hope. Alexander learns to stop near reliable sources even if the terrain is poor. He learns to delay marches to avoid dehydration. These decisions look cautious. They save lives. Sieges complicate everything. An army outside a city must feed itself while preventing the city from feeding itself. This creates long stalemates. Supplies are stretched. Morale dips. You see this later at Tyre, but the lesson begins earlier. Sieges are not won by courage. They are won by patience and logistics. Alexander's army relies partly on local purchase. Coins circulate. Prices rise as demand spikes. Merchants follow the army, selling food at inflated rates. This creates resentment, but also supply. The army becomes an ecosystem. Soldiers trade, gamble, barter rations. Inequality emerges. Officers eat better. Common soldiers notice. Alexander occasionally intervenes, redistributing, punishing hoarding, but he cannot equalize everything. Control has limits. As the army moves deeper into Persian territory, supply lines stretch. Returning to base becomes impossible. Alexander shifts strategy: live off the land. This is dangerous. It risks alienating locals. But it reduces dependence on long supply chains. Orders are issued: take only what is necessary, pay when possible, punish excess. Enforcement varies. Discipline frays at the edges. You notice how Alexander's tolerance changes. Early on, he is strict. Later, exhaustion dulls enforcement. Campaigns wear down not just bodies, but systems. Animals are as important as men. Horses require fodder. Without horses, cavalry slows. Without cavalry, battles become riskier. So fodder becomes strategic. Fields are protected or destroyed. Seasons matter. Winter slows everything. In winter camps, boredom peaks. Soldiers wait weeks with little to do. Food is monotonous. Alcohol use increases. Arguments flare. Alexander allows festivals, games, sacrifices. Not for joy, but to break monotony. Routine kills morale as effectively as hunger. You begin to see that the army's greatest enemy is not Persia, it is exhaustion, hunger, and time. Every victory creates new supply problems. Every march adds mouths to feed. Captured cities must be managed, not stripped bare. Alexander balances speed against sustainability constantly. Too slow, and enemies regroup. Too fast, and supplies fail. This balancing act shapes every campaign decision, even when historians later attribute choices to ambition or genius. As the army moves farther from Macedonia, food stops being a background concern and becomes a daily strategic decision. You can feel the shift in tone among officers. Conversations that once focused on enemy movements now begin with questions about storage, harvest cycles, and roads that can support carts. Alexander's victories have increased his territory, but they have also increased his responsibilities. Every new region conquered must now sustain part of the army, or be passed through quickly before it collapses under demand. You begin to notice how carefully marches are timed. Alexander plans movements around harvest seasons. Fields heavy with grain are assets. Fields already stripped are warnings. In fertile regions, the army can pause. In poor ones, it must move quickly or starve. Foraging parties grow larger and more organized. They travel with written authority, stamped seals, and armed escorts. Their job is not just to take, but to count. How much grain is available? How long will it last? How many mouths can it support? Errors here are costly. Overestimate supplies, and men go hungry. Underestimate, and you move too soon, exhausting the army. Alexander learns to trust experienced quartermasters more than enthusiastic generals. Glory does not feed soldiers, accuracy does. The Persian road system helps. Royal roads, rest stations, and storage depots, built for administration, not war, become lifelines. Alexander repurposes them quickly. What once moved tax revenue now moves barley. You can imagine clerks hurriedly translating Persian records, trying to understand local measures. How much is a core? How many men can it feed? Mistakes are corrected through experience, not calculation. Sieges strain everything. At Halicarnassus, food becomes a weapon. The city is supplied by sea. The Macedonians are not. Time favors the defenders, until it doesn't. Supplies run low outside the walls. Soldiers ration. Morale dips. Alexander responds by rotating troops, reducing consumption, tightening discipline. He does not storm the city recklessly. He waits. Hunger is allowed to work on both sides. Waiting is harder than fighting. You begin to see the psychological impact of food scarcity. Men become irritable. Theft increases. Punishments become more frequent. Alexander walks the camp more often, speaking less, observing more. He understands that hunger breaks trust faster than fear. As the army pushes into regions less familiar with Macedonian presence, cooperation varies. Some cities open gates willingly, hoping to trade supplies for safety. Others resist, hiding food, poisoning wells, destroying crops. In response, Alexander adopts a pattern: reward cooperation generously, punish resistance severely. This is not cruelty for its own sake. It is a signal. Feeding an army requires compliance. In response, Alexander adopts a pattern: reward cooperation generously, punish resistance severely. This is not cruelty for its own sake. It is a signal. Feeding an army requires compliance. You see this most clearly in the treatment of cities that surrender quickly. Their granaries are protected. Their markets reopen. Soldiers are restrained. The message spreads. Logistics becomes diplomacy. Water grows more problematic as terrain changes. In arid areas, marches are planned at night or early morning. Camps are set near known sources. Scouts ride ahead to test wells. Men carry water skins. Animals collapse. When wells fail, panic spreads quietly. Alexander sometimes changes direction abruptly, not because of enemies, but because water is gone. These changes confuse chroniclers later, who search for tactical brilliance where there is only survival. There are moments of crisis. Long marches where rations are reduced. Days when food runs out before expected resupply. Alexander shares the shortage. This matters. He also orders the destruction of excess baggage. Non-essential items are burned. Tents are simplified. Comfort is sacrificed for mobility. This creates resentment among officers, who have grown used to small luxuries. Alexander does not argue. He insists. You notice a pattern here: when logistics tighten, hierarchy hardens. Orders become shorter. Discussion ends sooner. Survival narrows decision-making. Despite this, the army adapts. Soldiers learn new foods, new cooking methods, new rhythms. The unfamiliar becomes routine. Captured supplies create temporary relief. Spoils are distributed carefully, not all at once. Alexander learns that sudden abundance causes as much trouble as scarcity. Gambling spikes. Drinking increases. Discipline slips. So plenty is controlled as strictly a shortage. By now, feeding the army is no longer just about logistics. It is about maintaining cohesion over time. The army has been together for years. Fatigue accumulates. Men begin to think of food as memory. Macedonian bread. Wine from home. These things become symbols of distance and longing. Alexander listens to complaints but does not promise return. He cannot. The campaign depends on momentum. Each step east makes supply more complex, but retreat more costly. Most cities fall quickly. That is the quiet truth behind ancient warfare. Gates open. Leaders negotiate. Garrisons surrender when food runs low or hope runs out. Siege warfare, in theory, is about patience, but in practice, patience usually wins early. Tyre does not. You are now on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean in 332 BCE, standing before a city that has made an unusual decision. It will not rush, even when the world's most successful army is waiting outside its walls. Tyre is not dramatic in appearance. It is practical. The main city sits on an island just offshore, protected by thick walls rising directly from the sea. Supplies arrive by ship. Water comes from cisterns. The city has prepared for exactly this situation. Alexander arrives expecting negotiation. He does not demand surrender, only entry to perform a sacrifice to Heracles. This is a test, not a threat. Tyre refuses. Refusal matters. In most cases, Alexander would move on. Time is valuable. But Tyre controls ports, ships, and trade routes. Leaving it behind would create instability. Messages would pass through it. Enemies would find shelter. So Alexander decides to stay. And staying is expensive. You begin to notice how the pace of life slows immediately. The army stops marching. Camps settle into place. Routines change. Food distribution becomes tighter. Idle time increases. Sieges are boring in ways battles are not. Days pass without visible progress. Men repair equipment, sharpen tools, argue over small things. The walls do not move. Alexander orders the construction of a causeway, a massive stone road from the mainland to the island. This is not a moment of inspiration. It is a calculation. Ships alone will not work. The city's fleet is strong. The walls are high. Stone by stone, the army begins to build. This work is exhausting and repetitive. Soldiers haul rubble. Engineers measure. Progress is slow. The sea resists. Waves undermine foundations. Tyrian defenders watch and interfere, launching missiles and fire ships. You can feel morale sag. Men who signed up to march and fight now dig and carry like laborers. Discipline becomes essential. Alexander visits the work sites frequently, not to inspire, but to remind. Supply problems return. The army is stationary, but consumption continues. Nearby land is stripped quickly. Food must be brought in from farther away. Costs rise. The Tyrians are patient. They have planned for this. They ration carefully. They trust their walls and their fleet. Alexander responds methodically. He secures nearby ports. He gathers ships from allied cities. Naval power grows slowly. Nothing happens fast. Weeks turn into months. This is where Alexander's reputation is quietly forged, not by brilliance, but by refusal to quit. Lesser commanders would abandon the siege. Alexander absorbs frustration and continues. Punishments increase for negligence. Rewards are offered for progress. The system tightens. The causeway advances, collapses, advances again. Each setback feels personal. Each small gain is defended fiercely. What you notice, standing among the soldiers, is how patience becomes the true weapon. Not courage. Not speed. Just persistence. Alexander understands something important here. If Tyre can resist successfully, others will try. The siege is about reputation as much as geography. So he stays. And the longer he stays, the more everything depends on the outcome. By now, the siege of Tyre is no longer a brief campaign. It is a test of endurance. You can feel it if you walk through the Macedonian camps. Tension, monotony, and quiet calculation fill the air. Every day looks the same from a distance, but each day carries risks that accumulate imperceptibly. Alexander has learned to expect this kind of strain. After years of training and battlefield experience, he knows that a siege is less about dramatic charges and more about small, repeated actions, stone by stone, ship by ship, ration by ration. The causeway is the central problem. Built from rubble and timber, it must span hundreds of meters of sea to reach the island walls. The sea resists constantly. Storms wash away sections. Tyrian ships ram unfinished sections, scattering stones. Waves and tides undo labor. Yet, Alexander insists on continuing. Every day is a test of patience, discipline, and resource management. Men grow weary. Guards do not rotate efficiently. Tools wear down. Injuries accumulate. Even officers become irritable. But Alexander maintains order. He rotates labor, enforces discipline, and ensures the army continues to eat, even as supplies are stretched thin. Every day is about survival as much as construction. Food, predictably, becomes the quiet pressure behind all decisions. Grain, water, and wine must arrive in sufficient quantities to sustain tens of thousands of men. Supply lines stretch from the nearest friendly cities on the coast, hundreds of kilometers away. Delays are inevitable. Messengers carry requests for reinforcements and provisions. But replies arrive slowly, often outdated by days. One wrong calculation could lead to starvation before the walls fall. Alexander's engineers adapt constantly. They try stone, timber, sandbags, even floating platforms. The Tyrians adapt too. They fire projectiles, set fire to the timber, and sink ships attempting to block the causeway. Every advancement is met with resistance, turning each day into a miniature cycle of progress, disruption, and repair. You notice the psychological effect on the army. Soldiers are frustrated not by danger alone, but by the tedium. They long for action, for the battlefield clarity where victory is immediate and tangible. Here, victory is incremental and invisible. This monotony tests discipline more than any enemy soldier could. Alexander, aware of this, maintains a delicate balance. He allows minor entertainments, archery contests, athletic competitions, and small ceremonies, to break the monotony. These are carefully timed to avoid disruption of the siege itself, and they serve to preserve morale. He is not indulging whims. He is strategically preventing collapse from boredom and fatigue. Meanwhile, the Tyrians continue to resist in a predictable but effective pattern. They conserve supplies, rotate their defenders, and respond methodically to Macedonian advances. They do not panic. They do not make reckless attacks. Their patience mirrors Alexander's, creating a slow, grinding stalemate. Months pass. Within the Macedonian camp, small incidents become magnified. Arguments flare over rations. Punishments are enforced for negligence or theft. Small acts of insubordination threaten the fragile cohesion of the army. Alexander observes silently, intervening only when necessary. His presence is as much about reassurance as it is about authority. The causeway finally reaches a point where ships cannot easily approach. Towers are erected on the newly formed land bridge. Siege engines, catapults, battering rams, are rolled into position. Each move is deliberate, calculated, and slow. Progress is measurable but painfully incremental. Through all this, Alexander's patience becomes as important as his ambition. Unlike in battles where speed and aggression dominate, here slow accumulation, careful calculation, and repeated small victories matter most. The siege demonstrates the quiet truth behind conquest: persistence often outweighs brilliance. Yet even as the causeway nears completion, a lingering question remains. The army has endured months of boredom, labor, and logistical strain. Soldiers are exhausted. Supplies are stretched. Tyrians remain resilient. When you imagine Alexander the Great, your mind probably leaps to battlefields, sieges, and vast marches across deserts and rivers. What rarely comes to mind is the quiet, grueling work that happens far from the clash of arms, sending and receiving messages. Yet the success of his campaigns depended on this almost invisible network of letters, riders, and couriers. You are now in the Macedonian camp, somewhere in Asia Minor. Soldiers march, engineers toil, and horses strain under the weight of supplies. Somewhere nearby, a rider prepares to leave with a message. Perhaps it is a report from a distant garrison. Perhaps it is a request for reinforcements or supplies. Perhaps it is a letter home from a soldier, written quickly on parchment and wrapped for delivery. Communication is slow. Roads are rough. Rivers, mountains, and hostile territories lie in the way. A courier traveling 100 kilometers in a day is considered fast. Weeks often pass before a single piece of news reaches its destination. By the time it arrives, circumstances may have changed completely. Alexander relies heavily on this network. He issues orders to distant satraps, coordinates supplies from depots, and communicates victories and expectations to allies and home officials. Every message matters. Every delay carries risk. A misdelivered order could lead to disaster. A late warning could result in unnecessary casualties. Yet the process is entirely human, fragile, and unreliable. Messengers are chosen carefully. Some are mounted cavalry, trained to ride long distances with minimal rest. Others are infantry who know the terrain and can avoid detection. Their loyalty is tested continuously, for the consequences of betrayal are severe. Some messengers disappear en route. Some are delayed by weather, bandits, or exhausted animals. You begin to understand the scale of the problem. Imagine an empire expanding daily, stretching from Macedonia across Asia Minor, Syria, and eventually into Mesopotamia. Each new conquest requires information to be gathered, reported, and acted upon. Orders must be sent ahead of the army, yet the army often moves faster than the messages. Coordination becomes a daily struggle. At home in Pella, Antipater manages Macedonia's affairs, relying on letters from Alexander and his officers. Each letter carries crucial intelligence. Yet delays mean that Antipater often acts on incomplete or outdated information. Rumors spread in their absence, and nobles interpret delays in ways that suit their own agendas. Miscommunication becomes a subtle form of danger, as potent as an enemy army. Letters also serve personal purposes. Soldiers write home to parents, wives, or siblings. They recount campaigns in terms that make hardships sound less severe, or embellish victories to impress loved ones. Alexander himself writes occasionally, sending directives, praise, or reprimands. These letters are carefully composed, formal, and deliberate, because the stakes are high. A poorly worded command could lead to insubordination or revolt. The delays introduce another layer of complexity: rumors. News travels faster than truth. By the time a letter arrives, stories have already circulated. Families worry unnecessarily. Allies misjudge situations. Soldiers exaggerate hardships. In Tyre, for instance, it is likely that Greek cities far away receive exaggerated tales of siege engines, heroic charges, and heroic deaths, stories often far removed from the slow, laborious reality of months-long construction and waiting. You notice how Alexander manipulates this system. Occasionally, he allows news of a victory to reach home slowly, controlling the narrative. He understands that perception is a tool. Accurate information is less important than the appearance of progress and competence. The movement of letters, even flawed, becomes part of psychological strategy. Every messenger, every letter, is a thread in a delicate web. Cut one, and confusion spreads. Delay another, and panic simmers. The network is not perfect, but it is essential. Alexander's genius is often celebrated on battlefields, but it is equally exercised in mastering the slow, uncertain mechanics of communication. From a soldier's perspective, the frustration is palpable. You march for days, weeks, or months without knowing whether the next town will provide food, whether reinforcements have arrived, or whether the king himself is nearby. You survive on rumor, bits of conversation, and letters that may be weeks old by the time they arrive. Anxiety becomes a constant companion. For Alexander, letters are both lifelines and instruments of control. He dictates orders with precision, anticipates possible misunderstandings, and often issues contingency instructions to cover delays. Yet no matter how careful, the system cannot eliminate uncertainty. Every day is a gamble, a negotiation with time, distance, and human fallibility. At night, the camp quiets, and messengers ride into darkness. You can hear the soft clatter of hooves over dirt roads, carrying intelligence, instructions, and stories. Each horse carries the weight of responsibility, yet progress is measured in inches, not triumphs. The lesson of these slow, fragile communications is clear. Conquest is impossible without management of information. Wars are won not only with swords, but with couriers, scribes, and the tedious labor of record-keeping. The campaigns you will remember for battles are equally defined by days of waiting, writing, and copying messages. As Alexander's army pushes deeper into Persian territory, the importance of communication grows exponentially. You might think that once a city falls or a battle is won, the next steps follow automatically. In reality, the most critical work happens in the quiet spaces between actions, the transmission of instructions, verification of supply, and management of human expectations. Messengers are now carrying more than simple letters. They carry detailed orders for satraps, garrison commanders, and supply officers. Some letters include troop movements planned months in advance, others dictate precise quantities of grain to be sent to depots hundreds of kilometers away. Each message must be read carefully, understood fully, and acted upon without deviation. Misinterpretation can cost lives, equipment, or even the loyalty of conquered peoples. You begin to notice a peculiar pattern. The longer the distance, the more Alexander anticipates uncertainty. He issues redundant instructions, sends multiple messengers along different routes, and even dictates fallback plans should communication fail. Yet even this meticulous care cannot eliminate the delays inherent in the system. A courier might be delayed by storms, rivers, or bandits. Letters may reach officials in a different sequence than intended, causing confusion. Rumors thrive in this environment. Soldiers interpret delays as signs of danger or failure. Local populations, hearing fragmented stories of Macedonian victories, may either resist more fiercely or capitulate prematurely. Officials interpret partial information according to their own biases. The slow flow of accurate intelligence leaves space for human error, exaggeration, and misjudgment to fill in the gaps. Alexander understands the psychological dimension of these delays. He uses it strategically. Some news of victories is deliberately held back to maintain morale in specific regions, or to prevent premature uprisings in cities yet to be secured. Conversely, stories of overwhelming strength are circulated to deter rebellion or resistance. In this way, letters become not merely functional tools but instruments of perception and control. At the same time, supply management is intimately tied to communication. Orders for food, weapons, and equipment cannot travel faster than horses or ships. Depots must be stocked in advance, often based on projected needs that may change by the time supplies arrive. Alexander spends long hours poring over these reports, cross-referencing distances, terrain, and weather conditions to anticipate shortages before they become crises. A single miscalculation could strand an army without food or water hundreds of miles from safety. Messengers themselves become part of a fragile ecosystem. Some carry multiple letters, increasing the risk of loss. Others ride alone, subject to exhaustion or attack. Each courier is trained to navigate hostile terrain, deliver messages accurately, and return with replies if needed. Their work is invisible, yet critical, and failure often goes unnoticed unless disaster strikes. Soldiers far from the center of command live in uncertainty. They wait days or weeks without knowing whether reinforcements have been dispatched, whether their supplies are on schedule, or whether the king himself is advancing or stalled elsewhere. Men fill the silence with speculation, creating narratives that may be wildly inaccurate. Letters become lifelines, but also the source of anxiety, because they are slow, incomplete, or delayed. You notice how Alexander adapts. He establishes protocols for urgency. Critical messages are sent via fastest couriers, often mounted and protected. Routine reports travel more slowly. He prioritizes communication based on risk and potential consequence. Even so, mistakes occur. Messages are misread, delayed, or lost entirely. The human factor, impatience, distraction, misunderstanding, cannot be eliminated. Over time, The army becomes a self-regulating communication network. Officers rely on messengers for guidance but also develop local authority, making decisions when instructions are delayed. Soldiers learn to interpret patterns, to understand the king's likely intentions even in the absence of explicit orders. This distributed decision-making is essential. The central authority cannot micromanage every action across thousands of kilometers. The cumulative effect of this slow, fragile communication is subtle but profound. Campaigns succeed or fail not only through courage, skill, or luck, but through patience, repetition, and careful observation. An army marches and fights only as effectively as the messages that reach its commanders, and messages travel at the speed of men and horses, not at the speed of thought. As the Macedonian forces advance, one truth becomes unavoidable: no victory is instantaneous, and no conquest is guaranteed when information itself is delayed. Every step forward carries the latent risk of miscommunication, of rumor, of uncertainty spiraling out of control. And yet, Alexander continues to push the boundaries of empire, relying not just on the sword, but on the careful, deliberate orchestration of letters, writers, and the human networks that must survive in the silence between victories. If you think Alexander the Great's campaigns were full of endless movement and constant excitement, think again. Much of his life on campaign was spent waiting and sleeping, often uncomfortably, in tents or under the stars. These nights were critical, because survival, discipline, and morale all depended on them. You are standing in the middle of a Macedonian camp just after a day's march. The sun has set behind distant hills. Soldiers are setting up tents, pitching small fires, and tending to animals. The smell of smoke, dust, and sweat hangs in the air. Everything looks quiet, but beneath the surface, tension is high. Sleep in such a camp is never simple. The army moves in a structured pattern, often in concentric circles for protection. Officers occupy slightly better quarters, but for the rank-and-file soldier, the night is short, uncomfortable, and full of obligations. Each man knows that his body may be required immediately at any sound of alarm. Tents are small and crowded. Leather mats, woven blankets, or sacks of straw serve as bedding. In winter, cold penetrates quickly. In summer, insects and heat prevent restful sleep. Soldiers share space with weapons and supplies, making comfort a secondary concern. The noise of the camp is constant. Horses shift. Dogs bark. Men argue over rations. Fires crackle. Even distant rivers or wind through trees carry sound that interrupts rest. Soldiers who are light sleepers become tense, aware that any disturbance might signal danger. Alexander himself does not escape these conditions. Though he has slightly better arrangements, he sleeps slightly and infrequently. He often walks the camp at night, inspecting, observing, and ensuring that discipline is maintained. He is aware that the quiet hours are when small problems, fires, theft, desertion, can become crises. Watch rotations are strict. Soldiers serve in shifts, often in the cold or rain. Each guard knows the penalty for negligence, yet fatigue increases the risk of mistakes. Sleep-deprived men are slower, more likely to falter under pressure, and more prone to arguments. Alexander relies on this system because the army is only as secure as its weakest sentry. Food and water also shape nights. Soldiers may rise in the middle of the night to tend animals, check supplies, or prepare for an early march. For officers, paperwork continues even after dark, reports must be written, orders clarified, and instructions dispatched for the next day. Sleep is interrupted by responsibility. Illness spreads more easily at night. Close quarters, damp conditions, and poor hygiene make camps breeding grounds for disease. Minor ailments become serious. Soldiers cough, sweat, and complain quietly, but the army must maintain readiness. Alexander's physicians do what they can, often improvising with herbs, bandages, and isolation of the sick. Tents and temporary shelters also impose limits on privacy. Conversations are overheard. Secrets are risky. Trust is fragile. Men adjust their behavior, speaking softly, guarding letters, and observing hierarchy even while lying down. Sleep is partial. Dreams are interrupted by reality. You notice the paradox. Despite the discomfort, the camp at night is also a time of organization. Orders for the next day are clarified. Soldiers rehearse formations mentally. Engineers plan bridge building or siege engines. Quartermasters count supplies. The slow, invisible work continues even as bodies rest. Alexander's presence amplifies the effect. Even when he sleeps, officers know he may wake at any moment. They prepare reports quietly, adjust rotations, and maintain order. Morale depends on both the king's leadership and the maintenance of routine. Through all this, one essential truth emerges: rest is never simply rest. It is a strategic necessity, a fragile balance between fatigue, discipline, and readiness. How soldiers sleep, and how well, can determine whether the army moves efficiently, responds to threats, or survives the next day's march. As the campaign stretches on, you begin to understand that nights define the day more than sunlight ever does. For Alexander's army, every evening is a microcosm of logistics, discipline, and quiet tension. Soldiers settle into the routine, but the routine itself is relentless. Sleep is fragmented, schedules are rigid, and vigilance never disappears. The army moves in phases, and the night is an extension of the day's planning. Officers organize rotations so that some men rest while others maintain perimeter security. Light infantry is often stationed on the edges, alert for any sudden movement. Cavalry may be kept ready for immediate deployment, tethered just outside the main camp. Engineers and support staff work late, repairing siege engines or preparing wagons for the morning march. Sleep is a privilege earned, not a given. You can feel the effect of repetition and monotony. Night after night, soldiers crawl into narrow tents or huddle by small fires, knowing they will rise hours later for inspection or duty. The familiarity dulls excitement, yet also breeds tension. Men grow irritable. Conflicts flare quietly over ration disputes, lost equipment, or perceived slights. Officers must intervene before small quarrels escalate, often in darkness and fatigue, which makes judgment harder. Alexander himself maintains a highly unusual rhythm. Though he sleeps minimally, he uses the night strategically. Quietly walking the camp, he observes the order, examines equipment, and listens to reports. He rarely speaks unless necessary, but his presence reminds soldiers that vigilance is constant. Men may be exhausted, but they are never truly unobserved. Weather imposes additional strain. Rain soaks tents, mud slows movement, and cold chills soldiers who cannot maintain warmth. Fires help, But smoke irritates eyes and lungs, and overuse consumes limited fuel. During winter campaigns, nights can be dangerously frigid, and frostbite becomes a quiet but serious hazard. Soldiers layer clothing and huddle for warmth, yet discomfort persists. The physical discomfort is compounded by mental strain. Soldiers and officers alike anticipate threats, enemy scouts, surprise attacks, or the sudden collapse of a structure such as a bridge or barricade. Even when no immediate danger exists, the mind remains alert. Anxiety compounds fatigue, creating a subtle form of insomnia that spreads through the camp. Sleep is shallow. Dreams are brief. Rest comes in spurts. Food and water schedules also shape the night. Animals must be fed and watered. Soldiers may rise early to prepare rations or to check supplies before marching. Delays in one task cascade into others. A mismanaged watch rotation or forgotten supply can affect thousands of men by dawn. Alexander's officers obsess over these details. Even minor oversights are costly. The tent layout itself reinforces hierarchy and discipline. Officers occupy slightly better quarters, centrally located and less exposed to the elements. Soldiers are arranged by unit and function, forming a pattern that allows rapid mustering in case of emergency. Even in darkness, spatial organization is essential. One misplaced tent or incorrectly placed fire can disrupt the entire camp's efficiency. Sleep in these conditions is strategic. It is not merely for rest, but for survival, coordination, and morale. A well-rested sentry notices subtle movements. A soldier who can function despite fatigue maintains formation. A tent carefully arranged reduces conflict and injury. The Army's ability to fight and survive is intimately tied to how well men endure nights like this. Alexander occasionally allows brief periods of leisure or distraction to mitigate the monotony. Small games, storytelling, or religious rituals are performed quietly to avoid disrupting schedules. These moments are tactical, designed to maintain morale and reinforce group cohesion, rather than for enjoyment. Through these long nights, a lesson emerges. Campaigns are not won solely by brilliant maneuvers or decisive battles. They are won through the persistent endurance of men who can operate effectively while tired, cold, hungry, and alert, night after night. The ability to maintain this rhythm often determines whether an army survives long enough to fight effectively in daylight. If you imagine Alexander the Great's campaigns, you probably see brilliant strategies, clashing armies, and heroic charges. Rarely do you picture the physicians, the men trying to keep tens of thousands of soldiers alive while they march hundreds of miles across unfamiliar lands. Yet without these medical practitioners, even Alexander's brilliance would have faltered. You are walking through a Macedonian camp at dawn. The air is thick with smoke from cooking fires, and the ground is churned with mud and horse dung. Soldiers groan as they wake, aching from the march. Some clutch injuries from the previous day's maneuvers, sprained ankles, cuts from weapons, or bruises from overworked animals. Others are sick with fevers or stomach ailments from spoiled food. Somewhere, a cavalryman limps toward a makeshift medical tent, where physicians prepare simple treatments with whatever supplies are on hand. Alexander's army has no hospitals as we think of them. No brick-and-mortar buildings. No centralized wards. Everything is improvised, dense, small shelters, or even open-air areas where patients can lie down, shielded from the sun and wind. Medicine must be portable. Supplies are limited. Medicines are carried in small boxes, bags, or leather pouches. The army's physicians are a mix of skilled Greeks, Macedonians, and locals recruited along the way. Their training varies, but they share a crucial knowledge: how to stabilize injuries and illnesses in conditions where retreat or prolonged care is impossible. They are not performing complex surgeries routinely, they are triaging, preventing infections, setting broken limbs, and improvising when necessary. You notice how closely medicine intersects with logistics. Herbs, wine, honey, oils, and bandages must be carried along with food and weapons. The Army's quartermasters allocate weight carefully. Too much medicine and there is less food or fewer arrows. Doctors constantly negotiate with officers to secure the supplies they need. Infections are the invisible enemy. Even a minor cut can become fatal if it festers. Physicians clean wounds, apply poultices, and monitor for fevers. They teach soldiers how to care for themselves when possible, washing, wrapping, and resting. Yet hygiene is difficult in dusty, crowded camps. Disease spreads easily, and epidemics can strike as suddenly as enemy attacks. Alexander himself is attentive to his men's health. He inspects the sick, asks for reports, and sometimes adjusts marches to allow the injured or ill to recover. He understands that an army marches not on swords alone, but on bodies capable of enduring fatigue, hunger, and wounds. Injuries from animals are common. Horses throw riders, oxen pull carts over uneven terrain, and pack animals collapse under loads. These injuries require immediate attention to prevent permanent disability. Broken bones must be splinted, sprains iced or wrapped, and wounds treated to prevent infection. Time is critical. Food-related illness is also a constant concern. Soldiers eat hastily prepared rations, sometimes spoiled, sometimes insufficient. Dysentery, fever, and dehydration are common. Physicians monitor hydration, prepare broths, and advise commanders on the limits of endurance. Sometimes entire units are slowed because illness spreads faster than the army can march. You begin to see the quiet power of medical knowledge. A physician who knows which herbs reduce fever or which poultices prevent infection can save dozens of men, and, by extension, hundreds more who rely on those men in battle. This knowledge is as strategic as any formation on the field. Beyond treatment, physicians serve as advisors. They inform Alexander and his officers about the limits of human endurance. How far can soldiers march before exhaustion becomes fatal? How long can a unit operate without food or water? Which routes are too dangerous for the weak or injured? Their guidance subtly shapes decisions, even though it is rarely recognized in histories of conquests. The Army's makeshift medical care also teaches improvisation. When equipment is scarce, doctors use sticks for splints, cloth for bandages, and wine or honey as antiseptics. They adapt quickly, working with what is available, often under fire or in harsh weather. You realize that without these invisible efforts, stabilizing wounds, tending fevers, preventing epidemics, Alexander's conquests could not have advanced as rapidly. Battles are one thing, but survival during months of marching through deserts, rivers, and sieges is entirely another. Medicine keeps the machinery of conquest moving. Yet there is a lingering uncertainty. Even the best care cannot prevent every death. Disease, accidents, and exhaustion claim lives silently. Every march carries hidden casualties, unrecorded and quickly forgotten. As Alexander's army advances deeper into Asia, the role of physicians shifts from occasional care to constant vigilance. You can feel it in the rhythm of the camp. Every day, wounded men appear, some from battle, others from exhaustion, accidents, or disease. The Army's physicians are now essential, not optional, to the functioning of the campaign. You notice the patterns immediately. Injuries from fatigue and overwork are more common than combat wounds. Soldiers march for hours over rocky terrain, carrying heavy packs. Sandals wear thin. Feet blister, ankles sprain. Pack animals collapse, dragging their loads into mud or rivers. Physicians spend as much time tending these injuries as they do treating sword cuts. Minor wounds left untreated can immobilize a soldier and slow a unit's march. Disease spreads quietly. Dysentery, fevers, and stomach complaints strike unpredictably. Tents become triage areas. Physicians divide patients based on severity, isolating those who are infectious. They improvise treatments using wine, honey, and herbal remedies. Even simple measures, washing bandages, boiling water, applying poultices, make the difference between survival and death. Medical care is also constrained by mobility. Unlike a static hospital, physicians move with the army, carrying portable kits. Herbs, compresses, oils, and bandages are limited. Decisions must balance immediate treatment against conserving resources for future emergencies. Every poultice applied is weighed against the risk of running out. You begin to see how Alexander relies on them strategically. Physicians advise commanders on the army's limits, how far soldiers can march without rest, how many days a unit can operate with limited water, when exhaustion will begin to degrade combat readiness. Their assessments inform the king's choices, shaping not just survival, but tactical options. Even battlefield injuries are handled with urgency. After clashes, physicians move quickly to stabilize men. Wounds are cleaned and bound. Splints are applied to broken limbs. Infections are minimized when treatment is prompt. The speed and efficiency of medical response can determine whether a soldier returns to duty or is permanently lost. Animals also receive care. Cavalry horses are vital. Pack animals carry food, weapons, and siege equipment. Physicians and specialized farriers tend hooves, injuries, and fatigue. A dead or disabled horse can disrupt entire supply lines, turning a logistical challenge into a strategic threat. Sleep and rest intersect with medicine. Exhausted soldiers are more prone to accidents and illness. Physicians advise on camp rotations, rest periods, and exposure to harsh conditions. Even a short delay in recovery can ripple through the army, slowing marches and reducing combat effectiveness. You notice improvisation everywhere. When proper materials are lacking, physicians substitute sticks for splints, cloth for bandages, and wine or honey as antiseptics. They create makeshift stretchers for the injured, using poles and blankets. Small tents become wards. Shade is improvised with tarps and branches. Efficiency is achieved through necessity. Infection remains a silent threat. Soldiers' living conditions are crowded, and sanitation is rudimentary. Dysentery spreads quickly, fevers flare unexpectedly. Physicians constantly monitor symptoms, isolate patients, and adjust treatment based on what works in the field. Their work is preventive as much as reactive. By the time Alexander reaches Phoenicia and prepares to lay siege to Tyre, the army's physicians have become indispensable. They maintain the human engine of conquest. Without them, injuries and disease would have incapacitated units, slowed marches, and weakened the army before it ever faced the walls of the city. Even so, limitations remain. Supplies run low. Treatment is sometimes imperfect. Some soldiers die despite care. Every loss is quietly noted but rarely celebrated. The army marches on, carrying both living and dying men forward. When we think of Alexander the Great's conquests, we imagine brilliant strategies, massive battles, and rapid marches across deserts, mountains, and rivers. What rarely comes to mind is the slow, delicate work of keeping an army paid, fed, and loyal, a task just as crucial as any victory on the battlefield. You are standing in a Macedonian camp somewhere in Asia Minor. Soldiers sit around smoldering fires, counting coins, examining worn armor, or debating whether their rations are sufficient. Pay is irregular, supplies often delayed, and yet morale must remain high. The army marches thousands of miles, and every soldier, infantry, cavalry, engineer, or camp follower, depends on the promise of reward to continue. Alexander understands this intimately. Coins are more than currency, they are a tool of discipline, loyalty, and control. Even the promise of pay is a motivator. Soldiers march harder, fight longer, and tolerate discomfort when they know that their labor and risk will be recognized with tangible rewards. The Macedonian system is surprisingly organized. Soldiers receive stipends and bonuses, distributed according to rank and merit. Officers manage smaller detachments, ensuring that pay reaches the front lines. Treasury officers count, weigh, and record every coin. Every transaction must be precise. Mismanagement can breed suspicion, resentment, and ultimately mutiny. Supply lines intersect with pay. Transporting coins across hundreds of kilometers is slow and dangerous. Armies rely on pack animals and guards to move the treasury safely. Bandits, enemy raids, or accidents can delay or even destroy payments. Soldiers wait anxiously, sometimes for weeks, before the promise of money materializes. Even when coins arrive, distribution is carefully managed. Officers are responsible for ensuring fairness, preventing theft, and recording each transaction. Soldiers often check one another to ensure no favoritism occurs. Every delay, every perceived injustice, can spark disputes or quiet unrest. Mutiny is a constant, though often invisible, threat. Soldiers who feel cheated, overworked, or ignored can refuse orders, slow marches deliberately, or grumble openly. Alexander faces this quietly but decisively. He knows that morale is fragile. A mutiny can undo months of planning and conquest. He observes, negotiates, and occasionally punishes, balancing fairness with authority. Beyond pay, coins serve another purpose: psychological reassurance. Soldiers see tangible evidence that their service matters. When an officer hands a coin with a commendation, it reinforces loyalty. When they fail to receive pay, even minor, trust erodes quickly. In the remote stretches of Asia, far from home, the absence of regular payment becomes a real danger. You notice the scale of the operation. Tens of thousands of men, hundreds of horses, and thousands of auxiliary staff all require careful accounting. Coins must be minted or brought from home territories. Supply convoys must be protected. Every coin is part of a delicate balance, enough to reward, but not so much that treasury shortages endanger the campaign. Delays are unavoidable. Rivers flood. Roads collapse. Enemy activity interrupts transport. Soldiers may march for weeks without pay. Yet Alexander has contingency plans. Spoils of war are redistributed. Captured treasure supplements pay. Local taxes and tributes are collected to maintain loyalty without overburdening supply lines. Even small amounts matter. Soldiers become aware of differences in pay between ranks, units, and regions. Complaints circulate. Rumors of favoritism spread quickly, amplified by boredom and fatigue. Officers are aware that discontent can escalate quickly from grumbling to open rebellion. Through this lens, you see a subtle truth: wars are not won solely by courage, tactics, or leadership. They are also won by managing money, calculating loyalty, and preventing small frustrations from snowballing into disaster. A single missing stipend or delayed bonus can have consequences that ripple far beyond the coin itself. By the time Alexander reaches the Persian heartland, the army has learned the rhythm of payment: wait, receive, march, fight, repeat. Coins maintain morale, reinforce discipline, and sustain loyalty, often in ways more enduring than battlefield glory. As Alexander's army presses further into Persia, the importance of money grows exponentially. You begin to notice how coins are as strategic as swords, and how the flow of currency can dictate not only loyalty but also movement, discipline, and even survival. Soldiers march long distances, often through hostile terrain, without certainty of what lies ahead. Rations are limited. Horses grow tired. Weapons and armor require repair. In such conditions, the promise of pay, whether from regular stipends or spoils of war, becomes the invisible engine keeping men moving. Without it, fatigue, frustration, and resentment quietly accumulate. Alexander has to manage multiple sources of funds simultaneously. Treasury wagons carry minted coins. Captured Persian treasure provides ad hoc bonuses. Local taxes supplement pay in certain regions. Each source comes with complications. Transporting coins over long distances requires guards, pack animals, and constant vigilance. A single attack can wipe out months of accumulated pay. Distribution itself is a careful ritual. Officers count coins meticulously before handing them out. Soldiers check each other, ensuring no one is favored. Even minor miscalculations can breed resentment. If one unit perceives another as being rewarded more, muttering begins. Rumors of favoritism travel fast, amplified by boredom and fatigue, and Alexander knows that small discontent can escalate into serious unrest. Mutiny is the ever-present shadow. Soldiers who feel cheated may slow marches, neglect duties, or openly defy orders. Even disciplined Macedonians are human. They weigh risk and reward constantly. Alexander manages this by combining fair payment with visible enforcement of discipline. He balances generosity with authority. A single act of perceived injustice could spread across the army faster than any battle rumor. Spoils of war also play a role in loyalty. Captured wealth, coins, jewelry, and valuables, are distributed according to rank and effort. Officers often receive larger shares, both as reward and incentive to maintain order among their men. Soldiers understand that plunder supplements regular pay, but it also introduces potential tension. Greed can lead to theft, disputes, or accidents. Alexander's presence and careful oversight are essential to prevent chaos. Money is not merely about pay. It is also a tool of psychological control. Soldiers who see the king carefully managing funds understand that their well-being is a priority, and that the chain of command functions reliably. When coins are delayed or mismanaged, anxiety and frustration grow, sometimes even before the army encounters the enemy. Rationing interacts with payment. Soldiers may receive food in proportion to their rank or recent performance. A lack of pay affects morale more than hunger itself, because the promise of compensation validates effort. Conversely, receiving coins during hardship reinforces loyalty disproportionately. Alexander uses this understanding to motivate his men, subtly influencing behavior without issuing direct orders. Even the smallest coins matter. Soldiers notice discrepancies between units, between officers and men, and between regions. A single delayed payment can ignite complaints that ripple through the ranks. Alexander mitigates this by planning ahead, supplementing treasury funds with local contributions, and maintaining a careful ledger of who receives what. Through all this, you begin to see a hidden truth: the success of an army depends not only on strategy and courage, but on meticulous financial management. Delayed pay, miscounted coins, or poorly managed spoils can derail months of careful planning. Discipline, morale, and obedience are intricately tied to the flow of currency. By the time Alexander reaches the gates of Persepolis, the army is aware of a simple rule: a soldier marches and fights not only for glory, but for the coins that affirm his labor. The management of money has shaped daily life as much as the battles themselves. Imagine Alexander's army: thousands of men, horses, pack animals, and wagons, facing a range so high and unforgiving that the mountains themselves seem to resist passage. This is the Hindu Kush, a barrier that tests not strategy or courage, but endurance, patience, and sheer human stubbornness. You are at the base of a snow-dusted slope. The wind bites your face, and the air feels thinner with every breath. Soldiers huddle in furs and blankets, trying to stay warm. Horses stamp impatiently. Wagons groan as men struggle to maneuver them over rocky paths. Every step is laborious, every mile feels longer than the last. The first challenge is altitude. Breathing becomes difficult. Fatigue sets in quickly. Soldiers unaccustomed to high elevations gasp, stumble, and complain. Even Alexander's seasoned veterans are affected. Horses lose stamina. Pack animals collapse under loads they would carry easily in lower lands. The terrain itself imposes limits. Simple marching becomes a Herculean task. Cold is relentless. Frost bites exposed skin. Snow and ice make footing treacherous. Fires are difficult to maintain in thin air and strong wind. Clothing is limited. Soldiers improvise with blankets, furs, and layered garments, but warmth is never guaranteed. Hypothermia is a constant threat. The terrain challenges both movement and organization. Narrow passes force units to march single file. Wagons cannot pass certain inclines. Engineers are called upon to construct makeshift bridges over ravines, remove obstacles, and reinforce paths. Progress is measured in meters rather than kilometers. Morale is fragile. Complaints rise. Soldiers grumble about the cold, the pace, the food, and the sheer difficulty. Commanders must mediate disputes while maintaining order. Even minor arguments threaten cohesion. The Army's success depends on unity in a landscape that encourages fragmentation. Supplies are another problem. High altitudes and rough terrain slow transport. Food may freeze or spoil. Water is scarce, often trapped in snow or ice. The Army must ration carefully, sometimes forcing men to march on empty stomachs. Each day's progress depends not only on human will but also on careful planning and adaptation. Alexander himself is exposed. He climbs alongside his men, supervising routes, motivating troops, and occasionally making personal decisions about paths to take. He understands that leadership in these conditions is as much about demonstrating endurance as issuing orders. Men watch him closely, their respect and obedience hinge on seeing him share the hardships. Animals are a constant concern. Horses slip, break legs, or collapse. Pack mules can no longer carry loads and must be abandoned. Engineers construct sleds to move supplies over snow, but these are slow and fragile. Loss of animals affects the Army's mobility, morale, and ability to maintain the pace needed to avoid further exposure to harsh conditions. Even the concept of time changes. A single day's march through flat plains might cover dozens of kilometers. Here, it barely reaches 10. Progress is slow, repetitive, and grueling. Soldiers become anxious, questioning whether the summit will ever come. Complaints are constant, ranging from hunger to cold to boredom to fear. Yet, Alexander insists on persistence. Retreat is not an option. Success requires enduring discomfort, mastering the terrain, and maintaining discipline. Every careful step, every improvised bridge, every ration counted, is part of a monumental effort that will define the Army's ability to continue the campaign. The Hindu Kush is not just a physical obstacle, it is a test of human endurance, leadership, and ingenuity. As Alexander's army climbs higher, every aspect of daily life becomes more difficult. The challenges are relentless: thin air, freezing temperatures, treacherous terrain, and the constant weight of supplies. Success depends not on genius in battle, but on patience, planning, and the resilience of exhausted men. You can see it in the soldiers' faces. Their breaths come in ragged gasps. Muscles ache from hauling packs, lifting wagons over rocks, and helping animals climb slopes. Frost crusts their hair and eyelashes. Many complain, not out of cowardice, but because survival in these conditions requires constant effort and vigilance. Each voice of complaint is a signal to officers that morale is waning, requiring careful management. Supplies become the central concern. Food freezes or spoils. Water sources are limited, snow must be melted, and ice chipped carefully to provide drinking water. Horses and pack animals require extra care, their bodies under continuous strain. Every wagon, every sack, every horse is critical. Losing even a few animals can slow the army by days. Alexander must constantly assess what can be carried, what must be left behind, and how best to ration resources without jeopardizing the army's progress. Engineering is another relentless task. Narrow passes, steep cliffs, and unstable terrain require makeshift bridges, reinforced paths, and constant clearing of obstacles. Engineers work tirelessly, often exposed to wind and snow, improvising with ropes, planks, and stones. One misstep, and a wagon or mule falls, disrupting hours of work and threatening supplies essential for the Army's survival. The soldiers' complaints are constant. Hunger, cold, fatigue, and fear all intersect in a chorus of grumbling. Officers must balance discipline with empathy, listening to concerns while maintaining order. Alexander himself walks alongside the men, observing conditions and demonstrating endurance. His presence quiets dissent but cannot eliminate discomfort. The Army learns that persistence, not complaint, determines who succeeds in the march. Altitude imposes a quiet but deadly challenge. Shortness of breath, dizziness, headaches, and fatigue sap strength. Even seasoned veterans must rest more often. Every climb becomes an exercise in pacing, measuring distance not in kilometers but in effort and endurance. Men learn to conserve energy, adjust breathing, and take turns assisting animals or carrying heavier loads. Strategic timing is essential. Alexander calculates not only the safest paths but also the pace required to avoid overexertion. Rest stops, camp locations, and supply distribution are all carefully chosen to maximize efficiency and minimize casualties. Misjudgment can result in frostbite, exhaustion, or loss of animals, each a threat to the Army's operational capacity. Despite hardship, small victories sustain morale. Reaching a summit, securing water, or successfully crossing a precarious pass provides moments of relief and accomplishment. Even minor achievements are celebrated quietly because progress is measured in inches and hours, not dramatic triumphs. Communication along the Army is critical. Messages from the front of the column to the rear, from engineers to officers, and from scouts to commanders must travel across harsh terrain and noisy wind. Miscommunication can stall movement or endanger lives. Even a small delay in relaying instructions requires improvisation and rapid decision-making by local leaders. Through all of this, one reality becomes apparent. The human mind and body are tested far more by mountains than by enemy forces. Alexander's skill lies not in taming the terrain itself, but in organizing men, animals, and supplies to survive it. Discipline, engineering, rationing, and endurance combine to create success where raw courage alone would fail. When we imagine Alexander the Great's campaigns, we picture sweeping victories, brilliant maneuvers, and conquests of cities and kingdoms. What we often overlook is what happens after the dust settles, the slow, methodical work of governing territories, collecting taxes, appointing officials, and maintaining control over people who might still resent foreign rulers. You are standing in a recently conquered city. The walls are still scarred from siege engines, the streets are uneven, scattered with debris. Soldiers patrol the area, ensuring order. Local officials shuffle nervously. Merchants try to reopen shops. Peasants return to fields, uncertain who will protect them or demand tribute. It is here that the real challenge begins: administration. Alexander does not leave territories to chance. He establishes satraps, local governors who act as intermediaries between the Macedonian command and the population. These men are often carefully selected from Macedonian or Greek officers, but occasionally local nobles are retained to ease transition. Their job is tedious and essential: enforce law, maintain order, collect taxes, and ensure loyalty. Taxes become the invisible lifeblood of governance. They fund garrisons, pay soldiers, maintain supply lines, and provide for the king's court. Yet tax collection is complicated. Local economies are diverse, money may be scarce, and records incomplete. Alexander's administrators must adapt quickly, balancing fairness with efficiency. Excessive demands risk rebellion, too little risks bankruptcy. Daily administration is slower than conquest. Meetings, inspections, and paperwork replace the excitement of battle. Satraps review land holdings, negotiate with local leaders, and adjudicate disputes. Every decision is weighed. One unjust ruling can spark unrest. One ignored complaint can escalate into revolt. Alexander oversees this from a distance, often relying on letters, messengers, and trusted officers to implement his directives. Garrisons are another crucial factor. Soldiers left behind to secure a city require pay, supplies, and supervision. They interact with the local population constantly, and small incidents can become flashpoints. Discipline must be maintained without excessive harshness. Cooperation, loyalty, and deterrence are balanced delicately. Alexander also institutes waiting rooms of power. These are symbolic spaces where new satraps or officials wait for audiences, decisions, or confirmations. They are quiet, administrative places, not palaces of grandeur. In these rooms, alliances are negotiated, reports are read, and decisions are postponed until full information is available. Time in these waiting rooms tests patience and political acumen as much as battle tests courage. Letters flow incessantly. Orders are sent to one city, then another, detailing troop rotations, supply deliveries, or tax schedules. Messengers traverse dangerous terrain. Errors, delays, or lost correspondence can have real consequences: confusion over tribute, mismanagement of local armies, or rebellion. The army that conquered must now act as a civilizing force, maintaining the appearance of stability while enforcing authority. Local populations observe and react. Some comply readily, hoping for protection or rewards. Others resist quietly, hiding resources, slowing supply lines, or refusing taxes. Alexander's administrators must read these behaviors carefully, making subtle adjustments that prevent minor dissatisfaction from erupting into revolt. The pace of governance is frustratingly slow compared to the swift victories on the battlefield. Every triumph must be cemented through negotiation, taxation, and supervision. Soldiers, accustomed to decisive outcomes, must now adapt to patience, paperwork, and diplomacy. Victory is meaningless if it cannot be sustained by order and administration. Through all of this, Alexander understands a subtle truth: empires are held together by routine, attention to detail, and quiet persistence, not by heroics alone. The work of governance, appointing satraps, monitoring taxes, and ensuring communication, determines whether conquest becomes lasting empire or temporary occupation. After conquest, the army moves on, but the real work of empire remains. You can see it in every provincial city: satraps managing local disputes, scribes counting grain and coin, soldiers enforcing order, and messengers crisscrossing vast distances with letters and reports. This is governance in motion, slow and painstaking, yet essential to maintaining Alexander's expanding dominion. Satraps are the first line of authority. They act as the king's eyes, ears, and hands in each province. Their duties are vast, overseeing law and justice, ensuring tribute is collected, supervising garrisons, and keeping detailed reports for the central administration. Each satrap must balance firmness with diplomacy. Heavy-handedness can spark rebellion, leniency may invite exploitation. Even small miscalculations, misjudging the loyalty of a local official, underestimating the influence of a merchant family, or failing to monitor a garrison, can ripple into serious instability. Taxes are central to control, but collecting them is rarely straightforward. Grain, livestock, coin, and labor are all levied in varying amounts. Administrators must translate local economies into systems that can be understood, quantified, and enforced. Record-keeping is essential, but errors are inevitable. Miscounted crops or misplaced ledgers can create disputes, resentment, or shortages. Soldiers stationed to secure collection points may grow impatient or demand bribes, further complicating the process. Communication links the empire together. Messengers carry letters between satraps and Alexander's central command, reporting progress, incidents, or requests for reinforcements. Delays, lost correspondence, or misinterpretation can slow decision-making. The farther a province is from the center, the more autonomy a satrap must exercise, and the greater the risk of deviation from Alexander's vision. Waiting rooms of power, quiet spaces where decisions are postponed, reports examined, or new appointees briefed, become symbols of bureaucratic patience. Officials learn to navigate these spaces, where political skill and timing are as important as knowledge. Alexander uses them strategically, allowing time for careful consideration while signaling the weight of his authority. Every day spent in these spaces reinforces the principle that control is measured not in swift conquest, but in sustained oversight. Garrisons stationed throughout the empire act as both deterrents and enablers of governance. Soldiers enforce tribute collection, protect trade routes, and respond to disturbances. Yet their presence can also generate tension. Local populations resent foreign troops, and small incidents, an insult, an accidental injury, a dispute over resources, can escalate if ignored. Officers must manage both the soldiers and civilians, constantly negotiating between force and diplomacy. Even supply chains play a role in governance. Grain, weapons, and coin must reach distant provinces to maintain order and prevent unrest. Administrators coordinate deliveries, anticipate shortages, and monitor the condition of transported goods. A single delay can ripple across hundreds of kilometers, affecting food security, morale, and loyalty. Meanwhile, Alexander's attention to detail extends beyond immediate administration. He evaluates the loyalty of satraps, observes the effectiveness of local justice systems, and adjusts tax policies based on reports from the field. Decisions made quietly, often months after a conquest, ensure that cities remain under control long enough to contribute to the empire's strength. Through all this, it becomes clear that the work of governing is slower and more fragile than winning a battle. Soldiers, satraps, merchants, and messengers form a delicate network. Each node, whether a coin in a treasury, a letter in transit, or a garrison soldier, is essential. If one link fails, disorder can spread. And as the sun sets over distant provinces, you notice the quiet endurance required to maintain empire. Soldiers have marched, cities have surrendered, But now the empire's stability depends on patience, routine, and constant vigilance. When you think of Alexander the Great's army, you might imagine unstoppable soldiers, moving relentlessly from one conquest to the next. But the reality on the ground is far less glamorous. Behind every decisive battle, there are tired men, longing for familiar fields, families, and the comfort of home. These soldiers are the reluctant conquerors, carrying the weight of empire while dreaming of return. You are standing in a camp somewhere in the Persian heartland. The sun beats down, or perhaps a bitter wind sweeps through the tents. Soldiers sit on the ground, sharpening weapons, patching armor, or quietly staring at maps of distant lands they may never see again. Their faces are weary, their steps slower than in earlier campaigns. Conversations often drift to home, parents, wives, villages, and routines that now feel unimaginable. The march itself is exhausting. Months and years of movement over mountains, rivers, deserts, and plains take a toll on both body and spirit. Feet blister. Muscles ache. Food is often insufficient. Water is scarce, or tainted. Horses and pack animals struggle under loads that increase as the army expands, carrying not only weapons and provisions, but also siege engines, coins, and the spoils of distant cities. Soldiers' reluctance shows in small ways. Some march at the back of the column, less eager to take initiative. Others grumble loudly, criticize leadership, or delay routine tasks. Complaints are frequent, about food, about weather, about the constant pace. Officers walk a fine line, correcting behavior without sparking open defiance. Even highly disciplined Macedonians are human, and the longer the campaign continues, the harder it becomes to maintain morale. Alexander is aware of this. He knows that even victories cannot erase the burden of time, fatigue, and longing. He adapts strategies to motivate men, distributing spoils, granting leave when possible, offering bonuses, and occasionally appealing to glory or honor. Yet he cannot create homes out of distant deserts or mountains. Motivation must come from rewards, discipline, and the quiet presence of leadership. Even the simplest routines become tests of patience. Soldiers wait for weeks in camps for rivers to fall, roads to be cleared, or instructions to arrive. Each pause amplifies longing. Men imagine their families, the warmth of hearts, and the certainty of village life, ordinary concerns that clash with extraordinary demands. The army is also far from uniform in motivation. Younger soldiers may crave adventure and glory, while older veterans long for the safety of home. Mixed within every unit are men from distant regions, speaking different languages, with loyalties that may stretch between Macedon and their local city-states. Alexander must manage this complexity, maintaining cohesion while honoring the personal fatigue and reluctance that grows day by day. Despite all of this, soldiers march on. They fight when required, endure harsh climates, and perform complex maneuvers. Reluctance is quiet, rarely expressed in outright rebellion, yet it is always present. It seeps into planning, patience, and morale. Officers must read it constantly, adjusting orders, pacing, and incentives to prevent small dissatisfaction from spiraling into mutiny. Even the spoils of war are insufficient to fully motivate some men. Coins, jewels, or land grants can only temporarily distract from the larger truth: men are human. Their bodies and minds have limits. The farther they travel, the more the comforts of home become a psychological necessity. As the campaigns stretch further east, the human cost becomes increasingly apparent. Alexander's army is no longer simply a disciplined force, it is a collection of weary men. Soldiers whose courage is tested not by enemy spears alone, but by the relentless passage of time, distance, and hardship. You can feel it in the camp. Soldiers shuffle their feet, dragging packs that seem heavier with each mile. Conversations are dominated by home, fathers, mothers, siblings, wives, or villages they may never see again. Younger recruits are restless, veterans are impatient. Even the most disciplined units display quiet signs of discontent, slower responses to orders, delayed tasks, or whispered criticisms of leadership. The psychological strain is profound. Soldiers face constant uncertainty. The enemy may strike without warning, supply lines can fail, and the terrain itself is punishing. Each day demands endurance beyond what men had imagined possible. Complaints are common, and some escalate into outright threats of mutiny if they feel ignored or overburdened. Alexander understands the fragile balance between motivation and revolt. He employs multiple strategies to maintain loyalty. Distribution of spoils is deliberate. Gold, silver, or other treasures are shared according to rank and merit, reinforcing both fairness and hierarchy. Promotions and rewards provide hope, even for men who are exhausted or homesick. He occasionally allows brief respite, letting units camp for longer periods when conditions permit. Yet these measures have limits. Some soldiers simply want to return home. After years of marching across deserts, rivers, and mountains, even generous pay or loot cannot fully restore morale. Letters from family, stories of life back in Macedon, and memories of ordinary food and sleep become powerful forces, silently pulling men away from devotion to the campaign. Mutiny, though rare, is a constant threat. Small units express dissatisfaction subtly, slowing their pace, refusing to carry extra loads, or leaving equipment behind. Officers must intervene tactfully, often mediating disputes while demonstrating authority. Heavy-handedness can ignite rebellion, leniency risks undermining discipline. Alexander's skill is measured not only on the battlefield, but in these quiet, tense negotiations with human fatigue. Supply lines and marches are intertwined with morale. Soldiers worry if food will last, if horses are fit for the next day, or if winter clothing is adequate. Each worry amplifies their longing for home. Engineers and quartermasters work tirelessly to ensure provisions, but conditions often make perfection impossible. Men must adapt, improvising or enduring shortages, which further tests patience. The farther the army moves, the more personal endurance becomes central to survival. Fatigue, mental strain, and homesickness are cumulative. Even a minor injury, a blizzard, or a delayed ration can tip a soldier into despair. Alexander monitors these pressures carefully, understanding that the success of his campaigns relies not solely on strategic brilliance, but on the quiet resilience of human beings pushed to their limits. Interestingly, this discontent sometimes yields unexpected benefits. Soldiers who complain often express practical concerns, difficult terrain, supply needs, or dangerous routes. Officers and Alexander can use these observations to adjust strategy, ensuring that complaints become a source of information rather than rebellion. Through this lens, You begin to see that reluctant soldiers are not simply obstacles, they are indicators of the Army's limits. Their fatigue, fears, and frustrations provide critical feedback. Managing these factors effectively allows Alexander to push farther than any general before him, maintaining cohesion despite the human desire to turn back home. Yet, as the sun sets over an unfamiliar landscape, you notice the quiet resignation in the ranks. The men march onward, not because they are eager, but because the distance to home is both torment and tether. When Alexander's army finally reaches the Indian subcontinent, the excitement of conquest is tempered by the slow, unglamorous work of governance. Mountains, rivers, and distant provinces may be conquered with swords and strategy, but administering newly acquired territory demands something quieter, more tedious: bureaucracy. You are in a camp on the banks of the Indus River. Soldiers relax briefly after crossing difficult terrain, but the work of administration never stops. Satraps, scribes, and officers prepare reports on population, resources, and local governance. The terrain itself is complicated: fertile plains, dense forests, and broad rivers all present logistical challenges. Roads are minimal, and communication with the army's rear is slow. Every decision, every order, must account for distance and delay. Alexander relies on satraps to maintain control, as he did in Persia. These governors act as intermediaries between the Macedonian command and the local population. They supervise tax collection, enforce laws, and manage garrisons. Some are Macedonians or Greeks, others are local nobles incorporated into the administration to smooth transitions. Their tasks are routine but essential, and they often work in temporary offices, tents, courtyards, or makeshift buildings rather than palaces. Taxation is a central concern. Grain, livestock, and other local resources are assessed, collected, and recorded. Administrators must translate complex local economies into systems the Macedonian command can understand and control. Mistakes can provoke unrest. Insufficient oversight can allow corruption, theft, or inefficiency. Satraps spend long hours auditing accounts, reconciling receipts, and ensuring soldiers assigned to garrisons are provisioned correctly. The army itself acts as both enforcer and observer. Soldiers in garrisons maintain order, prevent rebellion, and protect trade routes, but they also report complaints and disturbances. Their presence is a constant reminder that conquest is not over once the battle ends. The territory must be managed carefully, minute by minute, day by day. Communication is slow but critical. Letters travel from distant provinces, reporting conditions, requesting reinforcements, or notifying Alexander of political or logistical developments. Miscommunication can have cascading effects: delayed tax collection, missed supply shipments, or unrest among civilians and soldiers alike. Alexander must rely on trusted officers and messengers to maintain control across vast distances. Even the most mundane administrative tasks can have high stakes. Misrecorded taxes can anger local farmers, delayed rations can demoralize garrisons, and overlooked disputes between towns or villages can grow into rebellion. Every decision is amplified by the vast distances and the slow pace of information. Even mundane routines, maintaining ledgers, reconciling supplies, recording land assessments, take on strategic importance. Errors can ripple through the army, affecting morale, resource allocation, and operational readiness. Officers and satraps alike develop systems to minimize mistakes, but bureaucracy at the edge of the known world is inherently slow, imperfect, and frustratingly complex. Through all this, one reality emerges clearly: Alexander's conquest is not complete until administration functions as reliably as an army in the field. Success depends on small, persistent acts of record-keeping, oversight, and supervision, performed far from the glory of battlefields. By the time Alexander's forces moved deeper into the Indian subcontinent, the army has shifted from purely conquering to managing conquest. The frontier is unfamiliar, rivers are wide and unpredictable, and populations are diverse, speaking languages and following customs unknown to Macedonians. In this environment, bureaucracy becomes the critical backbone of the empire. Satraps carry the burden of governance. Their duties are endless: collecting tribute, mediating disputes, supervising garrisons, and reporting everything to the central command. A satrap may spend hours reviewing tax rolls, inspecting granaries, and ensuring soldiers are properly supplied. Small errors, a miscounted bushel of grain, a delayed delivery of weapons, or a misallocated coin, can ripple outward, affecting thousands of people and hundreds of soldiers. You notice the complexity of tax collection firsthand. The land yields grain in some regions, livestock in others, and labor in still others. Satraps must quantify resources, calculate fair assessments, and ensure the amounts collected satisfy Alexander's expectations without provoking rebellion. Records are kept on papyrus, clay tablets, or simple ledgers, often in temporary offices or tents. Accuracy is paramount, yet conditions, heat, humidity, rain, insects, constantly threaten documentation. Communication is slow and fragile. Messengers travel long distances across rivers, forests, and mountains, carrying letters, reports, and instructions. Delays are inevitable. Misinterpreted orders can result in soldiers receiving inadequate supplies, peasants paying too much tax, or garrisons failing to enforce law. Every error must be corrected through further communication, a tedious cycle that can take weeks or months. Soldiers themselves play a role in administration. Those left in garrisons help enforce tax collection, maintain order, and report issues back to satraps. Their presence reminds locals of Macedonian authority but also provides critical intelligence: which villages are cooperative, which families hoard resources, and which regions might resist. Even small complaints from soldiers must be recorded and addressed, adding to the endless flow of paperwork. Alexander understands the limits of centralized control. While he directs the overall strategy and appoints trusted satraps, he allows local administrators flexibility to act within guidelines. This decentralization is essential in a landscape so vast and varied, yet it requires careful oversight. Reports flow upward constantly: grain yields, troop movements, local disputes, and resource inventories. Each report forms a chain of accountability stretching across hundreds of miles. Even minor administrative tasks acquire strategic significance. Inspecting warehouses, auditing tax records, or documenting village populations may seem dull, yet each contributes to the army's ability to move, fight, and survive. Without reliable information, resources cannot be allocated properly, garrisons may starve, and rebellion can spread unnoticed. The seemingly boring work of bureaucracy is, in fact, a silent engine of conquest. Morale also depends on administration. Soldiers in garrisons expect pay, food, and supplies, which must be meticulously tracked and delivered. Delays, shortages, or errors can cause grumbling and, in extreme cases, mutiny. Maintaining discipline depends as much on accurate record-keeping as on leadership in the field. The landscape has its own complications. Flooded rivers, dense forests, and remote villages make oversight slow and unpredictable. Satraps and officers improvise constantly, adjusting collection schedules, redirecting messengers, and reinforcing garrisons as needed. Every decision requires balancing efficiency with caution. Too much rigidity leads to failure, too much leniency risks disorder. Through this lens, you begin to see that Alexander's ability to conquer is only matched by the slow, painstaking effort to sustain what has been won. Battles are decisive, but administration ensures that victories are preserved, and that men, resources, and loyalty remain intact. When we think of Alexander the Great, it is easy to remember kings, generals, and victories. But for every city captured and every battle won, there is a far quieter story: the soldiers who never returned home. Ordinary men, farmers, artisans, sons of Macedon, who left familiar fields and villages to march thousands of miles across deserts, mountains, and rivers. Many never saw their families again. You are standing in a camp somewhere in the distant reaches of the empire. The air is filled with dust from marching columns, the smell of horses, and the faint tang of smoke from cooking fires. Men move slowly, carrying weapons and packs that have grown heavier with months of travel. They speak little of glory, most discuss home, remembering rivers, forests, and towns they left behind. Some speak in hushed tones of comrades who fell ill, slipped on rocky slopes, or were struck down in battle, names that will be quietly erased from memory by the relentless march of the army. The causes of death are varied and unremarkable, yet relentless. Disease claims more men than swords. Dysentery, fevers, and infections spread quickly in crowded camps. Medical care, though surprisingly sophisticated for its time, is limited by mobility, supplies, and knowledge. A minor wound, left untreated in the field, can become fatal. Soldiers succumb quietly, often far from friends or family, and are buried hastily, sometimes in mass graves or by the side of the road. Combat also takes its toll. Skirmishes, sieges, and full-scale battles leave bodies scattered across plains, rivers, and mountainsides. Each fallen soldier represents not a story of heroics, but of ordinary life interrupted. Men who fought, yes, but who also worried about homesickness, hunger, and exhaustion. Death is constant, and often anonymous. Harsh environments are another enemy. Marching through deserts, crossing icy rivers, or climbing treacherous mountains kills as surely as the enemy. Frostbite, heatstroke, dehydration, and exhaustion claim lives quietly, far from the fanfare of battle. Even the hardiest soldiers sometimes cannot endure the combination of climate, terrain, and relentless marching. Supplies and food are central to survival, yet often inadequate. Rations spoil or freeze, water is scarce or contaminated. Hunger weakens men, making them susceptible to disease, accident, and despair. Every march becomes a calculation. How far can we go before men collapse? How long before illness spreads through the column? Ordinary soldiers endure far more than the generals ever do, yet their stories rarely reach the historical record. Morale is fragile. News of fallen comrades spreads quickly, breeding fear as well as grief. Soldiers who witness repeated deaths sometimes question the campaign, the leadership, or even their own choices. Small acts of kindness, extra food, a shared blanket, or a comforting word, become critical lifelines, yet they are often too little to offset the scale of loss. Despite all this, the Army marches on. Men understand that survival requires endurance, discipline, and careful attention to daily routines. Yet every mile traveled increases the number of those who will never return. Even victories are bittersweet, carried out under the shadow of loss, as Alexander's army presses deeper into unfamiliar lands. The invisible weight of mortality grows heavier. You can feel it in the camp, men moving slower, speaking less, casting anxious glances at their comrades. Every march, every river crossing, and every mountain pass is not only a test of courage but a gamble with survival. Death is constant, though rarely dramatic. It arrives quietly, through disease, fatigue, accidents, or minor wounds that fester into fatal infections. Disease is the deadliest enemy. Dysentery, malaria, fever, and other illnesses spread rapidly in crowded encampments. Medical knowledge, while advanced in some respects, is limited by the lack of infrastructure, sanitation, and mobility. Physicians and attendants do what they can, washing wounds, applying poultices, or setting broken bones, but resources are scarce. A single infection can sweep through a unit, leaving dozens of men dead before the sickest can be moved to relative safety. Combat, while dramatic, accounts for only a portion of deaths. Skirmishes, ambushes, and battles scatter bodies across plains, hills, and riverbanks, yet even these casualties are often overshadowed by the attrition of continuous marching and environmental hazards. Soldiers slip on ice, fall from cliffs, drown in rivers, or collapse under heavy loads. Each life lost is recorded quietly, sometimes buried hastily, with no ceremony and often no acknowledgement beyond the immediate unit. Food and water shortages amplify the danger. Rations spoil or run out, leaving men malnourished and weakened. Horses, mules, and oxen carrying essential supplies die, further straining the army's ability to survive. Hunger saps strength and morale, increasing vulnerability to disease and accident. Even small shortages can tip the balance between survival and death for the ordinary soldier. The psychological toll is just as deadly. Men watch friends die, witnessing the fragility of life in conditions they cannot control. Fear, grief, and homesickness wear on the mind, weakening the body's resilience. Soldiers whisper about returning home, debate desertion quietly, or cling to small rituals to preserve hope. Yet the army cannot stop. The march continues, and each mile increases the likelihood that another soldier will never see home again. Alexander observes this quietly. He cannot prevent every death, yet he attempts to maintain morale. Spoils, pay, and recognition help, as do moments of rest or easier marching when terrain allows. Officers mediate disputes, provide encouragement, and distribute resources judiciously. But leadership can only mitigate the losses, never eliminate them. The silent toll continues. Even the most routine marches are dangerous. Narrow passes hide cliffs, Rivers are swift and unpredictable. Forests conceal wildlife and hostile groups. Engineers and scouts work constantly to make travel safer. But accidents are inevitable. Ordinary soldiers bear the consequences of mistakes, misjudgments, and the relentless uncertainty of life on campaign. Death far from home shapes not only the army's size but its spirit. Units shrink quietly, morale fluctuates, and the survivors carry memories of fallen comrades that influence decisions, caution in battle, and loyalty to leadership. Every man who dies reminds the living of their fragility, the cost of empire, and the true human price of conquest. And yet, even as graves accumulate along roads, riverbanks, and hillsides, the march continues. The army presses onward, each step a testament to endurance, discipline, and the silent sacrifice of those who will never return. The day Alexander the Great died was not marked by fanfare or dramatic declarations, at least not at first. Instead, it began with silence, an almost incomprehensible quiet in a city that had known constant movement, conquest, and administration for years. Pella, Babylon, or whichever royal residence you imagine, is still and heavy with anticipation, though the king's pulse no longer sets the rhythm. You are in the palace, walking through vast halls where tapestries and gold reflect flickering lamplight. Servants move cautiously, unsure whether to continue their tasks or await orders that will never come. Soldiers and officers linger outside, their usual energy replaced with uncertainty. They know the news will spread quickly, and with it, the delicate balance of power will tilt in unpredictable directions. Alexander's death is sudden yet inevitable, the result of fever, exhaustion, or perhaps long-standing injuries and alcohol. Doctors and attendants can do little. The greatest conqueror the world has seen succumbs to forces beyond even his legendary control. The body lies in state, regal but vulnerable, a stark reminder that even the mighty are mortal. Immediately, questions arise: who will lead the army now? Who will govern the empire? Unlike a kingdom confined to a single region, Alexander's territories stretched thousands of miles, encompassing diverse cultures, languages, and economies. Every satrap, officer, and general is forced to reconsider loyalties, ambitions, and strategies. The absence of a ruler leaves a vacuum more dangerous than any enemy army. Inside the palace, generals and advisors gather in small, tense groups. Discussions are hushed, filled with speculation and maneuvering. Some argue for Alexander's half-brother, Aridaeus, whose mental capacity makes him pliable. Others consider Alexander's unborn child with Roxana as the legitimate heir, though a newborn cannot govern. Each proposal has supporters and detractors, creating immediate friction among those accustomed to unified command. Meanwhile, soldiers stationed across the empire, hundreds of leagues away, wait for news, unsure whether to march, defend, or seize initiative. Supply lines, previously coordinated meticulously, risk chaos without clear orders. Garrison troops are particularly vulnerable to unrest. In distant cities, satraps must decide whether to assert authority in Alexander's name or await instructions that may never arrive. The empire itself is fragile. Conquest was achieved through skill, discipline, and relentless marching, but holding it together relies on the king's presence. Administrators, satraps, and generals now face a sudden test. Can the mechanisms of governance function without the man who inspired loyalty, fear, and obedience across continents? Rumors circulate quickly. Some claim Alexander will awaken, others whisper about secret heirs, conspiracies, or traitorous officers. Fear mixes with grief. Soldiers, accustomed to marching, fighting, and receiving clear commands, are now confronted with uncertainty. Without a leader to follow, discipline frays, and individual ambitions begin to surface. Even within the palace, the atmosphere is charged. Advisors debate, generals negotiate quietly, and servants move cautiously around the body. The corridors echo with questions: who decides the succession? How will the army respond? Which cities will remain loyal, and which might rebel? The empire that once seemed unshakable is suddenly fragile, exposed to the chaos of human ambition. Alexander's death reveals an uncomfortable truth: an empire built on a single individual's vision is vulnerable the moment that individual is gone. The systems of administration, garrisons, and satrapies functioned under his authority, but without him, each relies on negotiation, persuasion, and loyalty that may not survive scrutiny. The morning after Alexander's death is chaotic in ways that no battle could have predicted. The king's generals, satraps, and advisors gather in tense groups, each silently calculating how best to secure their position in an empire suddenly without its central figure. Decisions that once required little thought: who commands a garrison, which taxes to collect, which orders to execute, become fraught with uncertainty and risk. You are in the palace again, observing the subtle maneuvers of powerful men. Some approach Alexander's corpse with reverence, others with curiosity, and a few with barely concealed calculation. Loyalty is now tested not by the outcome of war but by the ability to seize opportunity in the absence of leadership. Each officer considers the potential for promotion, the risk of confrontation, and the possibility that a single misstep could result in dismissal, exile, or death. The empire itself teeters. Alexander's territories span from the Mediterranean to the Indus, including regions recently conquered, where local populations have only just begun to adapt to Macedonian authority. Satraps in distant provinces face a dilemma: maintain order under the illusion of Alexander's continued leadership, or assert authority in his absence. Communication is slow, and delayed or misinterpreted messages can trigger mutiny, rebellion, or opportunistic uprisings. In the army, uncertainty breeds tension. Soldiers accustomed to decisive command now hesitate, unsure whether to obey the closest general or wait for orders from the palace. Some question the legitimacy of Alexander's appointed heirs: his half-brother Aridaeus, perceived as weak, or the unborn child of Roxana, whose claim is symbolic but impractical. The lack of a clear leader magnifies personal ambitions, rivalries, and mistrust. Political maneuvering dominates the day. Generals quietly negotiate alliances, promising support for one candidate in exchange for future power. Satraps weigh the loyalty of their garrisons, knowing that soldiers can be both protectors and threats. Advisors manipulate perceptions, emphasizing rumors or exploiting divisions among peers. Every conversation, every gesture carries significance, and small errors may have disproportionate consequences. Even administration is affected. Taxes, tribute, and resource allocation, previously coordinated meticulously under Alexander's authority, risk disruption. Satraps must make autonomous decisions, reconciling local needs with imperial expectations that may no longer exist. Engineers, scribes, and messengers operate in a vacuum, dependent on instructions that may arrive too late or be contradictory. The empire functions, but it functions precariously, like a bridge spanning a river during an earthquake. Alexander's charisma had unified a vast, diverse empire through personal presence, force of personality, and shared ambition. Without him, the human elements of loyalty, fear, and respect must be replaced with negotiation, coercion, and vigilance. Ordinary soldiers, seasoned officers, and local administrators all test these boundaries, consciously or unconsciously probing how far they can act independently without reprisal. As day turns to evening, the palace is alive with whispers, cautious movements, and unspoken calculations. The empty throne casts a long shadow across halls and courtyards, symbolizing not only the absence of a king but the uncertainty of the empire's future. Even the most disciplined generals realize that the greatest challenge now is not a foreign army or distant city, it is managing human ambition, fear, and indecision in the absence of authority. History has a peculiar way of preserving greatness. For Alexander the Great, it was not just through monuments, cities, or legends, but through lists, records, and accounts, documents that catalog campaigns, battles, spoils, and appointments. These lists are meticulous, methodical, and impersonal. They reduce the man who conquered half the known world to a sequence of names, dates, and numbers, stripping away emotion, grandeur, and human complexity. You are in a dusty archive in Babylon or Alexandria, sifting through papyrus scrolls, clay tablets, or early codices. Each sheet contains accounts of garrisons, troops, satraps, or treasures collected in far-flung lands. Names of cities are recorded with their tribute, mountains crossed are noted with distances, and battles are logged with casualty counts. In these lists, Alexander's life is measured as actions and outcomes, not stories or personal experiences. Soldiers who marched with him, advisors who negotiated treaties, and ordinary civilians who witnessed his campaigns often disappear from memory, preserved only indirectly through tallies and registers. The grandeur of conquest becomes quantified, coins minted, cities renamed, territories surveyed, and rivers charted. Even feats that demanded immense courage or suffering are reduced to entries in a ledger. The creation of such records is partly practical. The empire Alexander built stretched across continents and cultures. Administration, taxation, and succession required accurate, consistent documentation. Satraps filed regular reports, scribes tallied treasures, and generals accounted for soldiers, supplies, and weapons. Each list served as a tool for governance, ensuring that distant provinces could be monitored and resources allocated efficiently. Yet these records also shape the memory of Alexander. Future historians, biographers, and chroniclers rely on them to reconstruct campaigns, often emphasizing the measurable, cities captured, battles won, treasure acquired, rather than the mundane, the human, or the personal. His life, once full of strategy, conversation, and leadership, is distilled into lists that survive long after the voices, faces, and experiences of those who accompanied him have vanished. Even everyday details, like the struggles of soldiers crossing mountains, the work of scribes maintaining supplies, or the complaints of civilians under new rule, are marginalized. What survives in memory is measurable, objective, and verifiable: numbers, names, and official actions. The human stories, the nuance, and the fatigue are rarely recorded in these lists, leaving a partial, calculated version of reality. Lists also create a sense of inevitability. When you read through a record of Alexander's campaigns, you see the succession of victories, the expansion of territory, and the administrative order imposed on conquered lands. The chaos, fear, and improvisation, the human elements that shaped the outcomes, are largely invisible. The story becomes a tidy progression, easier to teach, recount, or memorialize, but far removed from lived experience. Through these records, the grandeur of Alexander's empire appears absolute, timeless, and complete. Yet the lists are silent on the men who died marching, the civilians who suffered under new taxation, or the soldiers who longed to return home. They are silent on fear, doubt, and ambition, the messy realities that made Alexander human.